in our data-driven society, we get used to looking at spreadsheets. And we have one here showing us the 4 different kinds of cookies, the 4 Girl Scouts, and the amount of cookies that they sold. And looking at this, I can see that Frankie sold 11 brownies, 20 chocolate chips, 15 oatmeal raisins, and 6 fig bars. And similar for each of these Girl Scouts. I could add these 4 items together and know how many total cookies Frankie sold, or how many of the individual kinds that she sold. I can also add these columns and know how many total brownies were sold, how many total chocolate chips, etc. So this gives me a way of storing more information than I could store in a single array, also known as a one-dimensional array, the kind that you have studied so far. This is a two-dimensional array, meaning that there are rows. These things that go along here are called rows, and there are columns. The vertical ones are columns. Now, in our study of arrays, we know that every element in an array has to be the same type. So we can have an array of ints, we can have an array of strings, but we cannot have an array that has ints and strings in there. So actually, it is not possible to store everything that is in here in one array. But we can store the numbers in the array. So we can create an array just to keep the numbers. And as before, we can have a single array to keep the names of the Girl Scouts and a single array to keep the names of the cookies. I copied that table from the spreadsheet onto my sketchboard here. This is what I ultimately want, although I know that I'm going to have 3 arrays. One to hold the integers, one to hold the names of the Girl Scouts, and one to hold the names of the cookies. I know how to do some of these things. I know how to make my cookie array and my name array. And here we have the declarations for our cookie array and name array. But now I need an array to hold these ints. Okay, I know it's going to be an array of ints. I need the idea that I have rows and I have columns. So I need to say how many rows and how many columns, and in this case the answer is 4. 4 rows, these are the rows, the horizontal ones, and these are the columns, the vertical ones. So I need to say I need 4 rows and 4 columns. And here we are saying 4 rows, 4 columns. Similar to the way that we declare a one-dimensional array, only instead of having one set of square brackets here, I've got 2. And then how many rows and how many columns. It's a little unfortunate here that I've got the same number of rows and columns, but the first one is the number of rows and the second is columns. And I always tell students, just remember RC Cola, rows and then columns. If you are comfortable with this so far, go to NetBeans, start a new project, declare your arrays. Well, if you did that, this is what you have so far. You have your name array, you have your cookie array, and you declared an array your two-dimensional array to hold your ints. Or where am I going to get some numbers from? I need to get them from, ultimately, I'm going to get them from a file. But right now, for speed, I'm going to generate these 16 numbers and put them into that array. Let's go back to the sketchboard. Here's a sketch of our two-dimensional array, and I have written the indices along the sides here. So if I want to generate a random number, here it's something between 0 and 20, and I want to put it into this spot here, and my array is called cookies. This spot here is row 0, these are all row 0, column 0. So that is 0, 0. Now I want to generate something and put it in this slot here. This is row 0, column 1. So with these 4 pieces of code here, these 4 lines of code here, I have generated a random number between 0 and 20 and put it into cookies 0, 0, which is this slot here. Let's just make note of the slots we have done. We did that one. Then on the second line, I put something into cookies 0, 1. 0, 1, that is this one. And then I put something into cookies 0, 2. And then cookies 0, 3, 0, 3 here. So I just put numbers into every element in my first row. And if I look at my code, I see I did the same thing over and over again, with one exception. There is something that is altering here. And when I see I've written code like that, that tells me, you know what, that was a loop. All I have to do is change my second number. So let's try that. Here is the loop that does exactly this. Start out with this variable. I've called it col. I could call it anything, but I've called it col because it's the columns. Starts at 0, goes up 2, but not including 4. So starts at 0, goes up to 3 actually. And then this piece of code here does this. So cookies 0, 0 is something, cookies 0, 1 is something, 0, 2, 0, 3. So this does this. So in place of this, we have this. Now, as you get more familiar with coding and with Java, you will be able to go straight to here. But it's okay at your stage right now to write out this and then look at this, reflect on this and say, you know what, that is a loop. I can write that loop. Here it is. Well, that took care of my first row, the 0th, the one called 0, the one index 0. Now I have to do the row index 1, which is going to be the same as this, only with a 1 in there. So here we are with a loop that puts random numbers into everything on my second row, the one whose index is 1. And then of course I have to do it again for row 3, the third row, which is the one index 2, and the fourth row, which is one index 3. And here we have that all written out. Now I have put numbers in every element in my array. The first two lines here, the first for loop here, takes care of row 1. It's actually row whose index is 0. So this one is the row with index 0. Let's see if we can put different colors in here. The second for loop takes care of this row here, the one whose index is 1, because I've got index 1 in here. The third row, the third for loop here, takes care of the row whose index is 2. So there we go, all the way along this row. And the fourth one does the one whose index is 3, and that is my fourth row over here in my sketch of my array on the top right hand side. So I've completed putting numbers into my array. And when I look at this, I say, oh gee, look, I've done the same thing time after time. Let's move this up a little bit. I've done the same thing 4 times. The only difference here is that on this line I've got a 0 in my row index, and then a 1, and then a 2, and then a 3. Well, this is what I did over and over again. The thing that changed was the number in the first square bracket. It went from 0 to 1 to 2 and to 3. So I know then that I have to put this, I have to put this, all of this, in some sort of a loop. And it is this first number, the number in this first brace here, that I need to change. So I'm going to put a K in here. And that K has to start at 0, go up to, but not including 4. So I have to put, I'll put it here, I have to put braces around everything that I'm going to do over and over. So here is my loop. It's one of these. The first number changes from 0 to 3. So I put a K in here, and that K has to go from 0, less than 4, or less than or equal to 3. And I've got my curly braces here because I want to do all of this within this loop. Basically, that's it. But usually, because I'm talking about rows and columns, instead of K, I put a variable called row. So we have our doubly nested loop, and we have put random numbers into 4 rows and 4 columns. Let's go to NetBeans and look at this. So here is our loop to put our numbers into 4 rows and 4 columns. Incidentally, instead of declaring our row and column in our for, instead of saying for int row equals 0, for int col equals 0, I declared row and column up on line 20. I had a feeling I might be using them time after time, so instead of keep initializing or keep declaring them. I did it on line 20. That's the only reason. So again, declared our arrays, filled up our two-dimensional arrays with numbers. Now I wanted to print them out just to see that I got some numbers in there. It's a very similar doubly nested loop. Lines 21 and 22 are exactly lines 25 and 26. But what do I do in my inner loop? I print out the value that I have in that particular element. And then I put a tab, and that was just so that I could space them out nicely. I'll show you it first without the tab. Just put a space in there because we're printing a number and then a space, a number and then a space. And when I have printed all 4 of my numbers, then print line is going to take me down to the next line. So lines 26 and 27 here is a complete loop. 26 and 27, that's a complete loop. And then line 28 comes after I have completed this loop. So 26 and 27, I print the contents of one row from column 0 through column 3 with spaces in between. Once I have done the whole row, then I go down to my next line, and then I go up to the top to line 25 and start on my next row. If I run this, I get my numbers here. Again, randomly generated, a space between each number. It doesn't look that easy to read, which is why here I put a tab instead of a space. And now when I run it, better, easier to read. They don't look so random. 19 happens quite a few times, but randomly generated numbers. Looking back at our original spreadsheet, we see that we had the brownie names across the top and the girls' names down the side, and we would like to do that in the output too. Of course, these numbers are different because we randomly generated them, but we want something that looks like this. So first we want to put the brownie names across the top. And this is where we output our 4 rows and columns, our two-dimensional array. We want to put the brownie names in before line 25, before I output my two-dimensional array. So lines 25 and 26 is a for loop in which we print out the items from our cookie array. And I put a tab in between each one. You can look at the output here. It's not doing very good. I probably need to figure out about a way to separate the names, but I'll figure that out in a minute, because right now I want to put the names, the Girl Scout names, in the first column here. So when I print out my first row, before printing out the first row, I want to print out name array 0. So where is it I print out my first row? This is where I am printing out a row. Before I print out that row, I want to print out my name. Just one single thing, just the value of name array 0. Well, name array 0 when row is 0, name array 1 when row is 1. So this is actually not a 0, but row. Let's see how that works. Not very well. I want Frankie, and then I want these numbers to be on the same line. So all I have to do is change that print line to a print. Looking better. Not great here, but looking better. Now I have to deal with spacing. And I have to move everything over so that it looks better. And sometimes all I can do is play around with it, figure out how many spaces I need. Well, maybe it doesn't look the greatest in the world, but it looks a little bit better. And we found that out just by playing around with tabs and spaces to try to get this in a reasonable shape. So now we have output our data, and now we think about what we might want to do with it. We could find out how many brownies, how many chocolate chip, how many oatmeal raisins, how many fig bars were sold. And we can also find out how many cookies Frankie sold, how many Janet sold, how many Sam sold, how many Abby sold. So let's do that. If I want to find out how many cookies Frankie sold, I need to add this number and this number and this number and this number. And what are those numbers? They are cookies. Cookie is the name of my array. Cookies 0, 0 plus cookies 0, 1 plus cookies 0, 2 plus cookies 0, 3. So I start out here with an F total, a Frankie total of 0. And then I go through my cookies array and I go right across the row with index 0, adding to my total. So let's look at it here. This is our row index 0. So I say, okay, F total is whatever it was before plus cookies 0, 0. Cookies 0, 0 is this number here, which is also a 0. So right now F total is 0. And then K becomes 1. And F total is whatever it was before, which is 0, plus cookies 0, 1. Cookies 0, 1 is this number here, this 8. So I'm going to add 8 to my 0, and now I have 8. And then, because lines 37 and 38 is a complete for loop, then K becomes 2, and I add to my total, which was 8, cookies 0, 2, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 2. I'm going to add 16 to my 8, which is 24. And then K becomes 3, so I'm going to add to my total. My total was 24, cookies 0, 3, and 0, 3 is this 12, and that is then 36. And then I have an output line, and I output that Frankie sold, excuse me, 36 cookies. Now I want to do this for Janet. So I say, okay, I'll do the same thing again. So I'm going to start out my Janet total at 0. And I'm going to go all the way along Janet's row, adding them all up. So I've got the same code here, except it's cookies 1. Here it was cookies 0. Now it's cookies 1 something because that's my row index 1. And then I'm going to print out my name array 1, which is Janet, and how many Janet sold. And if I look at the output here, I can see I got that done. And then obviously I can do Sam and Abby. But before I do that, I'm going to take a look at this code here. And I'm going to say, well, I do almost the same thing twice. What is it I am doing? I am going along the row, I'm adding things up, I'm outputting. Well, I have two different totals. I have an F total and a J total. Do I really need two totals? Do I really need to keep track of them? Maybe I can just call the whole thing total. Well, if I do that, well, I cannot declare total twice, but I certainly need to initialize it to 0 the second time. Okay, now I look at these and I say, well, they're very similar, except this index is a 0, here it's a 1, and here it's a 0, and here it's a 1. So if I got rid of one of these and said, okay, let's put curly braces around everything that I am doing several times, and I make this a for loop, not a K, but let's make it a W. And now I'm going to replace these zeros with W. And let's run it and see what happens. Okay, so I have something suspicious here because it says they both sold 30. So let's quickly check. 5, 16, 30, 15, 17, 26, 30. That was correct. All right, so now I know how many cookies everybody sold. And then the one remaining thing is to find out how many brownies were sold, how many chocolate chips, how many oatmeal raisins, and how many fig bars. So I have a very similar piece of code here. I start out with a cookie total being 0. And I need to go down the column whose index is 0. So I'm going to go down the brownie column, and first M is 0, so I'm going to add to my total cookies 0, 0, which is the 12. And then I'm going to add cookies 1, 0. 1, 0 is this one here. Row 1, column 0. And then M is 2, so I'm going to go and add cookies 2, 0. So row 2, column 0. And then row 3, column 0. And after I've done that, I can print out that we sold cookie total. And here, this is the name of my cookie, which here is brownie. And I had to add an S on the end. So we sold 19 brownies. I also had to put a space in between this total and the name of my my cookie. So I needed a space in between the 19 and the brownie. And if I realize that I need to do this 1, 2, 3, 4 times, just as I did before, I can put all of this in a for loop. So I'm going to start out by deciding what gets put in the loop. There are my braces, and so before this I need a loop. H is 0, H less than 4. Okay, so what is it? Where do I put the H? It's wherever I had these zeros before. And let's run that. Okay. And there we have our original data, and here we have our how many our individual Girl Scouts sold and how many different kinds of cookies were sold, making me hungry. Hope this helped.